He grabbed my arm in front of everyone. Not a tap, not a gentle touch, a grip. The kind that's meant to remind you of your place. And I remember thinking, this man has no idea. He has absolutely no idea. But I didn't say a word. I just looked down at his hand on my arm, then slowly looked up at his face. And I waited. Because I've learned something in 67 years of living. The truth always finds the right moment to speak for itself. I just never expected that moment to come quite like this. My name is Gerald. Most people call me Jerry. I'm not a man who takes up much space in a room. Never have been. I speak when I have something worth saying. I dress clean but not flashy. And I've spent most of my adult life doing things quietly, building things quietly, letting the work speak while I stayed in the background. That's just who I am. Some people mistake that for weakness. A lot of people, actually. And honestly, I've let them. Because I learned a long time ago that the man who feels the need to announce himself usually doesn't have much to announce. My son Daniel, he's 34 now, tall, good-looking, sharp. Gets that sharpness from his mother, God rest her. She passed when Daniel was 19, just 2 years into college, and that loss, it changed us both in ways I still don't fully understand. We grew closer in some ways and further apart in others. The grief sat between us like furniture neither of us knew how to move. He threw himself into his studies after that, then into his career, then into a world that was moving very fast, full of people with money and connections, and the kind of confidence that comes from never having had to worry about a bill in your life. And somehow, in the middle of all that, he met Vivian. Vivian is lovely, I mean that. She's warm and she's smart, and she clearly loves my son in a way that is real. I never had a problem with Vivian. My problem was never Vivian. It was her father. Richard Calloway, the kind of man who walks into a room and immediately begins calculating who in it is worth his time. Built his wealth in commercial real estate, hotel acquisitions, private equity, the kind of portfolio that gets written up in regional business magazines and displayed in framed copies on an office wall. He wore that success the way some men wear cologne, heavily, and in every room he entered. From the very first time Daniel introduced us, Richard looked at me the way you look at something you're trying to categorize. He took in my jacket, which was perfectly fine, by the way, my hands, the slight callus across my palm, and something just settled in his eyes. A conclusion, filed away, permanent. I was the dead wife's father, the modest one, the quiet one, the one who probably worked some decent but unremarkable job and lived in a decent but unremarkable house and had nothing to contribute to the conversation unless it was about something ordinary. He was never outright rude in those early days. It was subtler than that. The way he'd redirect a conversation just as I began speaking. The way he'd reference trips or investments or people I clearly wouldn't know, then look mildly surprised when I didn't react with awe. The way he once introduced me to one of his friends at a dinner as Vivian's father-in-law. He's from the older side of the family. As if I needed to be explained away. I let it go. Every time. Daniel noticed some of it. I could tell by the slight tension in his jaw when Richard made a comment that landed too close. But Daniel was building his life inside that world now. His career had taken off. He and Vivian had a beautiful home, and Richard was very much a presence in all of it. I wasn't going to be the thing that complicated that, so I showed up when I was invited. I smiled. I kept my opinions quiet and my wine glass full, and I told myself it didn't matter. And mostly, it didn't. Because what Richard Calloway thought of me had no bearing whatsoever on who I actually was. I knew that. I held on to that. Most days it was enough. Now, before I go any further, if this kind of story is speaking to something in you, some moment where you've been underestimated, looked past, quietly dismissed, I just want to say a like or a subscription helps these stories reach the people who need to hear them. It's a small thing, but it means more than you'd think. Now let me keep going because we're just getting to the part that changed everything. The 5-year anniversary party was Vivian's idea, and it was beautiful. I'll give credit where it's due. They rented out an event space in the city, a renovated building in the old warehouse district that had been converted into this stunning venue. Exposed brick, high ceilings, soft Edison lighting, a catering team moving through the crowd like water. The kind of place that makes you feel like the evening is already something special before a word has been spoken. I arrived a little early. That's my habit. I'd worn my charcoal blazer, gray slacks, a white shirt open just at the collar. I looked like what I am, a man of a certain age who takes care of himself, who respects the occasion without performing for it. I was carrying a gift for Daniel and Vivian, a set of first edition books I tracked down over the course of 3 months because Vivian had mentioned once, offhandedly, that she'd grown up loving a particular author. I don't forget things like that. The venue was filling up beautifully. Friends of Daniel and Vivian's, colleagues, some of Vivian's cousins, a few older couples I recognized from their wedding, and then, of course, Richard's circle. You could identify them easily, not by anything obvious, just by the particular ease they had in spaces like this, the assumption of belonging. I found a spot near the edge of the main room, not hiding, just comfortable. I was watching the door for Daniel when I felt it. Someone nearby in conversation glanced in my direction and then just as quickly away. Not unfriendly exactly, just assessing. I recognized the look. I've been getting it all evening in various degrees. Richard arrived about 40 minutes in. He came with his wife Eleanor, who is a perfectly pleasant woman who I believe is just tired in a way she's too well-mannered to name, and 2 of his business associates, men who arrived already mid-conversation about something that was clearly meant to be overheard. Richard spotted me from across the room and gave me a nod. Precise, the minimum required. I nodded back. The evening moved on. Daniel found me eventually and we hugged, and in that hug I felt my son the way you do sometimes. Not the grown man, but the boy, the 19-year-old standing at the edge of his mother's grave in the rain, letting me hold his shoulders because neither of us had words for any of it. I held on a second longer than usual. He didn't pull away. We talked for a few minutes. Good conversation. Easy. He looked happy, genuinely happy, and I held on to that image because it's the whole point, isn't it? That's what all of it had been for. Then he got pulled away by a wave of guests, and I was left again at the edge of the evening. The dinner service had begun in one section of the room, round tables with centerpieces and candles. I was scanning the seating arrangement, looking for my card, when one of the catering staff, a young woman, maybe 22, dark ponytail, moving efficiently through the room, passed close to me, and I stepped aside to let her through. I said, "Excuse me," first. She smiled. "Oh no, sorry, excuse me," she said, and kept moving. And that was the moment Richard chose. He'd been standing about 8 feet away, in the middle of something, and I don't think he'd planned it. I think it was just impulse. The kind of impulse that comes naturally to a man who has never once had to stop and consider how his words land. He walked toward me. Not toward me exactly, past me, but then he slowed. And then his hand was on my arm, wrapped around it just above the elbow. Firm, familiar in the worst way, like I was an object being redirected. He barely looked at me when he said it. "Hey, why don't you go sit with the catering staff, old man? You look a little lost." The words were light, almost joking, almost, but they weren't. And the people within earshot heard them. A couple nearby went very still. A woman I didn't recognize looked away immediately, the way people do when something uncomfortable happens, and they've decided not to be involved. Someone, I think one of Richard's associates, made a brief sound that might have been a stifled laugh. I stood absolutely still. His hand was still on my arm. I looked down at it, then up at him, and I didn't say a word. I just looked at him. The way you look at someone when you have all the time in the world and they don't know it yet. Something flickered in his face. Not doubt, not yet. Just a slight recalibration. Maybe he'd expected me to laugh along. Maybe he'd expected me to shuffle off, embarrassed, grateful for the direction. Maybe he hadn't expected me to simply stand there and look at him with complete, quiet calm. He let go of my arm, and then a voice came from about 15 feet away. "Richard." It was Hank Morrison, my oldest friend. 50 years I've known that man. We met when we were both 23 and building things with our hands and figuring out the world the hard way. He'd been standing near the bar, I hadn't even noticed him there, and now he was walking toward us with his drink in his hand and an expression I recognized immediately. It was the expression Hank gets when he's about to say exactly the thing he's thinking, and you'd better be ready for it. He stopped next to me, put his hand briefly on my shoulder in the way old friends do. Then he looked at Richard, and he said it very simply, very directly, with no drama at all, which somehow made it hit harder. "He owns this building." 4 words. I watched Richard's face. It's a strange thing to witness, the moment when a person's entire framework of a situation collapses. It doesn't happen all at once. It happens in stages. First, the blankness, where the brain simply hasn't processed the information yet. Then the search, the rapid, visible search for an alternative interpretation. Some way the words can mean something other than what they clearly mean. Then the arrival, the understanding, and then the pallor, the slow draining of something from the face. Richard's face went white. Not dramatically, not all at once, but it went white. "I'm sorry," he said, and I noticed that his voice, for the first time since I'd ever met the man, had an edge of uncertainty in it. Hank didn't repeat himself. He just looked at Richard the way you look at someone when the answer is obvious and you're being patient. "I own this building." "Well, the company I formed 31 years ago owns this building, along with 11 others in this district and several more across the state, none of which I talk about at dinner parties, none of which appear in any regional magazine. I've spent my career building from the ground up, reinvesting everything, staying out of the spotlight because the spotlight never interested me. The building we were standing in, the exposed brick, the Edison lights, the beautiful high ceilings that had made Vivian's eyes light up when she chose it. I'd purchased the property 17 years ago when it was a failing warehouse with broken windows and water damage. We'd restored it over 3 years, and eventually it had become one of the more sought-after event spaces in the city. I hadn't mentioned this to Daniel when Vivian chose the venue. I almost had, but it felt unnecessary. It was their evening, not mine. I hadn't mentioned it to anyone. Richard was looking at me differently now. The assessment from our first meeting, filed, permanent, concluded, was open again, being revised in real time, and I could see how disorienting that was for him, because he'd built his entire confidence on the accuracy of his first impressions. "I had no idea," he said, which was the first honest thing I'd ever heard him say to me. "I know," I said. "That's generally how I prefer it." By this point, the small circle of people around us had expanded slightly. Not a crowd, but enough. Enough people had caught the shape of what was happening to make the silence feel significant. Someone murmured something. I didn't catch what. "Daniel." Oh, Daniel. I saw him when his face changed. He'd been across the room, genuinely in conversation, and then something in the room's energy must have shifted because he turned, scanned, found me, found Richard, found Hank standing there. And I watched my son piece it together from 30 feet away. He came toward me, and the look on his face was complicated, the way his face has always been complicated when he's feeling more than one thing at once. There was confusion. There was shock. There was something that I think was guilt, though I wasn't sure yet what he was feeling guilty for. Maybe for not defending me earlier. Maybe for all the times he'd smoothed over a Richard comment with a subject change and a fresh glass of wine. Maybe just for not knowing, for not asking. He reached me and he looked at me and he said very quietly, "Dad, is that true?" "Been true for a while," I said. Didn't seem relevant. He closed his eyes for just a moment. When he opened them, they were bright in a way that had nothing to do with the lighting. Richard had gathered himself somewhat by then. He'd taken a step back, and his associates had created a slight physical distance from him, the way people do when they sense they've been standing too close to something embarrassing. Eleanor had appeared at his side. She wasn't looking at him. He extended his hand toward me. "Gerald, I owe you an apology. Clearly You don't owe me an apology because of the building," I said, and I wasn't angry when I said it. I want you to understand that. I was very calm, maybe the calmest I'd felt all night. "The building is just a building. You owe me an apology because you put your hand on my arm and dismissed me in front of people who are here to celebrate my son's marriage. That's the thing worth apologizing for." The room was quiet. Richard looked at me for a long moment, and I genuinely think, that something landed. Not just embarrassment, something actual. The recognition that he'd behaved badly, not because he'd misjudged my net worth, but because he'd misjudged my worth entirely, as if the two things were the same, which they are not and never will be. "You're right," he said. "I'm sorry." I nodded. Once. And then I let it go. Hank found me a few minutes later near the bar, and we stood together the way we've been standing together for 50 years. Not saying much, just existing in the same space. That's the thing about people who've known you your whole life. They don't need to perform the moment for you. They just stand there. And somehow that's everything. "You could have told him yourself," Hank said eventually. "I know," I said. "Why didn't you?" I thought about it. "Because I didn't want to. Because a man who only respects you after he knows what you own hasn't actually learned anything." Hank considered that, sipped his drink. "Fair enough," he said. The party continued. Life has a way of doing that, continuing, folding the sharp moments back into the soft fabric of the evening until the music and the conversation cover them over, and only the people who were closest to the center can still feel the outline of what happened. Daniel found me again later in the evening. After the speeches, after the dancing had started, he pulled me aside to a quieter corner near the windows and he said, "Dad, I need to ask you something." "Go ahead." "Why didn't you ever tell me about the buildings, about any of it?" I thought about his mother, about the years after she died when I put my head down and worked, because working was the only language I had for grief that actually made sense to me. About the early mornings and the late nights, and the decisions I made in quiet rooms that eventually added up to something no one saw coming because no one was meant to see it coming. "I told you what you needed to know," I said, "that I was fine, that you didn't need to worry, that you should go build your life." "That's not the same thing." "No," I said, "it's not." I looked at him. "Does it change anything between us?" He was quiet for a moment. "It changes how I think about how little I asked." That landed. I won't pretend it didn't. "You're asking now," I said. He put his hand on the back of my neck the way he used to when he was small, an old gesture, reversed now in direction. I put my hand briefly on his shoulder. We didn't need more than that. I stayed until the end of the evening, not to make a point, just because I wanted to. I danced once. Hank's wife Patricia pulled me onto the floor and I obliged. And I ate the very good food and I watched my son laugh with his wife in a room full of people who love them. And I thought, this is the thing. This is the whole thing right here. Before I left, Vivian found me. She'd heard what happened, pieced it together somehow, the way she pieces most things together. She hugged me for a long time. She didn't say much. At the end, she said, "I'm sorry about my father." "Don't be," I said. "He said sorry himself. That matters." She nodded. She was still holding my hand. "You should come for dinner soon. Just us. Just family." "I'd like that," I said. I collected my coat, said my goodbyes, thanked the catering staff on my way out because they'd done beautiful work and someone should say so. The young woman with the dark ponytail smiled at me again. I wished her a good rest of her evening. Then I walked out into the night air. The street was quiet, a few taxis, the low hum of the city doing what cities do, continuing, breathing, indifferent to the small human dramas unfolding inside the buildings that line its blocks. Inside one of which I happen to have a very long history and a very thick file of property documents. I stood outside for a moment, just breathing. Here's what I've come to understand in 67 years of being underestimated by people who confused my silence for absence and my humility for having nothing to offer. The truth doesn't need you to defend it. It doesn't need you to announce it or fight for it or wave it around in crowded rooms. The truth just needs time and patience and the willingness to be still while the other person runs out of assumptions. I've been called old before. It used to sting, I'll admit it, in the way all diminishments sting when you're still figuring out who you are. But I'm past that now. Old means I've seen things. It means I've outlasted things. It means I was here long enough to buy the building. I walked to my car. I drove home. I made a cup of tea, sat in my chair by the window, and I let the evening settle around me the way evenings do when something has shifted and you need to give yourself time to catch up to it. My phone buzzed. Daniel. A text. No words, just a heart. I set the phone down and smiled. If this story stayed with you in some way, maybe because you've been underestimated, or you've watched someone you love be dismissed, or maybe just because something in it felt true, a like or a subscription goes a long way. It helps stories like this reach the people who need them most. Thank you for listening all the way to the end. It means more than I can say.